All right, so we'll go ahead and get started now. Thank you guys for coming. As I said earlier, if you weren't in the room yet, my name is Allie Ellis. I'm the Interpretive Ranger here at Fort King George State Historic Site. I started off here part-time back in April of 2017, and I've been in my current full-time position since November of 2018. So in total, I've been here almost 4 years. Thank you for coming to part one of our Tricentennial Speaker Series in celebration of our 300th birthday this year. We'll be having a presentation each month of 2021, each about a different aspect of our local history. And so to kick off this series, I'm just going to be giving you a general talk about the history of the fort. So why is Fort King George important? How did it become a historic site? And why am I here telling you about it today? So the founding of Fort King George is considered by many to be the first step toward the founding of the Georgia colony. It was founded in 1721, which of course, as of this year, was 300 years ago. And in order to contextualize how and why Fort King George came to be and how it led to the founding of Georgia, first I'm going to step further back in time and we'll work our way back forward. So we know that people have existed in what is now the southeastern US for at least 12,000 years. The oldest record we have of people living on the Georgia coast specifically are known as the Wally, and that is spelled a little bit funny. It's G-U-A-L-E, and that's what the Spanish call them. Unfortunately, we do not know what they called themselves because the Wally don't exist today. Part of the reason for the demise of the Wally culture can be attributed to conflicts that they had with the Spanish missionaries here at the mission called Santo Domingo de Telaje. They also had conflicts with the Westo tribe, who were allied with the British, and of course diseases were a factor as well. We believe that Wally survivors of all of these conflicts and diseases and whatnot merged with other local tribes like the Yamasee. And their closest living descendants today are likely in the Muscogee Creek Nation. Here on the slide, you can see some examples of potsherds, little shards of pottery that have been found, and that's primarily how we know what we know about the Wally is through iconography on their pottery and stuff like that, and then written documents from things that Europeans wrote about. So I spoke a little bit a second ago about the mission, Santo Domingo de Telaje, that the Wally people were at. The mission system was actually the main way that Spain did their colonizing. You can see on this map over here, they had lots of missions up and down the coasts of Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas. And on the left there, you can see a typical rendition of what a mission would look like. It was typically a town that was centered around a church. And the main goal of these missions was to Christianize the natives. And there was an arrangement that the missionaries would try to come to with the natives. Sometimes that was made amicably, sometimes it's not. That they would, the natives would provide food and labor in exchange for tools and protection. And you hear about the Spanish missions out west in California, but these that were over here on the East Coast were actually here first. So Santo Domingo de Telaje, it was established in the late 1500s. If you've been to our site here at Fort King George, we believe its location was actually just to the west of our soldier cemetery. And the Telaje mission went relatively smoothly up until Juanillo's revolt in 1597. Juanillo is the Spanish name for a native man who was the Mico, or chief, of the Talamado tribe. And he was also the heir to the Wally chiefdom as well. Again, we don't know what he called himself, unfortunately. There are several aspects of Wally culture that they were expected to give up in order to conform and assimilate to Spanish culture and to Catholicism. One of the many simple things would be something like your name. You were probably referred to by a Spanish name rather than your birth given name. And in addition to that, a couple of key points of contention for the priests were over polygamy and divorce. When Juanillo was unable to take a second wife, like his family had been doing for generations already, that was kind of the last straw that broke the camel's back and spurred this revolt. Father Pedro de Corpa was beheaded in this revolt, and 4 other priests were also killed. Today, the Catholic Church refers to these priests as the Georgia martyrs. And lots of conflicts like Juanillo's revolts kept happening throughout Spain's empire. They were spread thin and they were racking up a lot of debt. They had pretty much depleted their whole armada. And the War of Spanish Succession broke out in Europe in 1701 after the death of their king, King Charles II, who had no heir. And Spain, France, and Britain, they all had different opinions on what should happen next after that. And Queen Anne's War is considered the American theater of that conflict. So you can see a map here. Spain's territory is in orange here. They've got lots of land out here to the west, as well as Spanish Florida. British territory is on the east coast in red here. All of this blue stuff is French. And then the purple is territory that at the end of the war was ceded from France to Britain. So that is land that they lost. And so here on this side of the Atlantic, British, Spanish, and French colonists were all fighting for control over North America. And each of these different European powers had different native tribes that they were allied with. And over the course of the war, a significant portion of the native population in Spanish Florida and in British Carolina were totally wiped out. Many tribes in this area suffered from the same fate as the Wally, in that we don't know a lot about them because they just don't exist anymore. Another result of this war, like I said earlier, France lost some of their territory to Britain. And these territories that they lost, it made them lose their main port access to the Atlantic Ocean, which caused a lot of problems for France. This really hindered their ability to travel back and forth between France and their colonies in the New World. And in order to get home or come back here, they had to sail through enemy territory. They had recently established New Orleans, and they would have to sail around Spanish Florida to get back home. That caused a lot of problems for them. And in comes Colonel John Barnwell, also known as Tuscarora Jack. And he was a keen military strategist. And as a military strategist, he was well aware of this kind of Game of Thrones-esque position between these 3 nations. Barnwell, he was born in Dublin, Ireland, and immigrated to Carolina in 1701. He was a surveyor and mapped a lot of the area that was being settled at the time. He staked a claim of about 6,500 acres of land on Port Royal Island up in South Carolina, and other nearby islands. He did fight in Queen Anne's War, but he primarily got his reputation and the nickname Tuscarora Jack when he enlisted the Yamasee natives and led a fight against the Tuscarora natives in Carolina in 1711. Many of the Tuscaroras were killed in this conflict, and the majority of those that survived left the area. They migrated up north along trade routes to New York and joined the Iroquois. And the British had been seeing the Tuscaroras as a problem for quite some time. And since Barnwell eliminated that problem for them, he was hailed as a hero when he came home. So John Barnwell was very prosperous. He had a rice plantation in Port Royal, and his family remained in the elite class for several generations. In fact, if you're from South Carolina or familiar with the area in South Carolina, you've probably heard of the Barnwells. Many of his descendants are still in the area today. So Barnwell, seeing the position that these 3 countries were in at the end of Queen Anne's War, he wanted to take advantage of that position. with Britain and Spain and France all eyeing this no man's land here, which we Georgians today call home, in between British Carolina and Spanish Florida. He proposed a plan for a screen of forts or a series of forts for the interest of expanding Carolina into this territory here. And he wanted to put that screen of forts along the Altamaha River. Of course, the Altamaha connects to the Atlantic Ocean here, but it also goes pretty far inland. It's made from the convergence of the Oconee River, which starts up near Athens, as well as the Ocmulgee River, which starts up near Macon. So you can get pretty far inland with it. And he was only granted permission for one of those forts here at the mouth of the Altamaha River. And that is where Fort King George ends up getting put. And it's the very first British settlement in what we call Georgia today. And settlement is a pretty generous term for it. We'll find out a little bit more about the conditions later on. But we'll go ahead and take a look at this map that Barnwell drew here on the right side. This is the area where he wanted to put the fort. And you'll see that Altamaha is spelled a couple of different ways. It took a while for them to decide how they wanted to spell it exactly. But this is where he ended up wanting to put the fort. It says Old Indian Town for 40 acres here. That's where the land had been cleared out, where the Wally had lived there prior to being driven out and killed by the Spanish. Then it gets to the actual founding of Fort King George. This is what happened 300 years ago, which we are celebrating this year. 300 years ago in 1721, Barnwell goes down to this boggy, swampy, unsettled area where neither the Wally nor the Spanish had lived for decades. And he brings with him a few different people. He brings several ornery scouts, a few soldiers, a sawyer named David Dubois, as well as several enslaved people, and together they build Fort King George. At this point, there were still vast stretches of old growth cypress trees, and cypress is what they cut down and used to build the fort. But Spain was not the only one with financial issues after Queen Anne's War. Britain was stretched pretty thin as well. And they were reluctant to grant the funding for a large garrison to send to Fort King George. But Barnwell had a solution to this problem. There were several garrisons already across Britain, each with about 50 soldiers stationed at each one. And he said, if you can spare 5 surplus soldiers from each of these garrisons, I'll have enough for my garrison without you paying anyone new. So all these surplus soldiers, most of them older soldiers that had served the crown already for plenty of years, they were sent to the coast of Wales under false pretenses, totally unaware that they were about to be shipped off to the colonies. Here we have a plan of Fort King George, and this is original. This is how it would have been laid out. This was drawn by a Switzer that had defected from the French army and come over to join them. And then these are a couple of pictures of the reconstruction we have today. There's a nice aerial shot. Then there's a shot of our blockhouse. So these soldiers that were here at Fort King George were not very pleased to be here. They weren't in the greatest health to begin with, and their journey across the ocean, during their journey across the Atlantic, almost all of them came down with scurvy. They had to spend some time recovering in a hospital in Port Royal before they were sent down to garrison the fort. And while they were here, they were dropping off like flies. Almost 150 soldiers died of diseases like malaria, yellow fever, dysentery, etc. None of those deaths were from battle. They were all from diseases because neither Spain nor France were in a strong enough position, either financially or militarily, to ever actually come and challenge the fort in battle. They did challenge it diplomatically, but they never came and attacked. So these soldiers, they were grumpy, they were sick, they were bored, they were quite often drunk. They were also a little stir crazy here in the middle of nowhere. It was a 3-day boat ride to the closest British city of Charlestown, or Charleston as we know it today. And by the winter of 1725, there was a fire that burned the fort down. Upon investigation, they couldn't determine what caused the fire, but they did say that if the soldiers did not start it themselves, they certainly didn't do anything to put it out. Because they were not very happy here. The fort was quickly rebuilt with thinner planks, and when that burnt down again in 1727, the fort was finally decommissioned. So, needless to say, circumstances at Fort King George were pretty grim, but despite that, it had a great deal of significance to Georgia's history. Barnwell's fort was successful in laying a British claim to the surrounding area. It was never taken from them by Spain or by France or any natives, and this paved the way for General James Oglethorpe up here in the upper left to found the colony of Georgia in 1733. He starts off with the city of Savannah. He led about 120 English colonists to settle there, but pretty soon after he lost faith in Savannah. He thought the settlers there were lazy, and he thought that if it came down to it, they would not be able to protect the colony from a Spanish attack. So he started planning for a second city closer to the Spanish border in this spot where Fort King George had been a few years prior. He was a little more discerning with the settlers he recruited this time. He went with Scots from Inverness, Scotland. And at this time period, Scots were pretty disgruntled. After the Disarming Acts of 1715, the Scottish people were not allowed to bear arms. They had had their weapons taken away. Many Scottish nobles had also had their land taken away. They were not very happy. And Oglethorpe told these Scottish Highlanders, if you come and settle this fortified town for me and protect my new colony from the Spanish down in Florida, you will be given your own land, you will get your guns back, and you will be issued brand new Brown Bess muskets. They were very new, top of the line, very high tech back then. And so the Scots, mostly from Clan Mackintosh, as well as from the Chatham Confederation, they came and settled New Inverness in 1736. Later, it was renamed to Darien, which is what it's called today. And that name is after a failed Scottish colony in Panama. And Oglethorpe was right to place his faith in these Scots. They proved themselves worthy in battle against the Spaniards more than once. In 1740, Colonel John Moore Mackintosh laid siege to St. Augustine. That was the closest Spanish city. And he actually had taken control of Fort Mose, just to the north of St. Augustine briefly. And then in 1742, the Scots of Darien aided the soldiers at Fort Frederica down on St. Simon's in warding off Spanish invasion in the Battle of Bloody Marsh, as well as the Battle of Gully Hole Creek. The Scots here in Darien also started the sawmill industry that made Darien a thriving port town for almost 200 years. And that industry lasted, they started it in 1740s, and it lasted up until 1925. The last sawmill here in Darien, the Savannah Lumber Company, shut down in 1925. And so today at our historic site, we honor the significance that Fort King George had in the establishment of our state, and we educate our visitors about that history. But how did we become a state historic site? Primarily because of this woman here on the left. Her name is Miss Betsy Lewis. Like I said earlier, the fort burnt down before it was decommissioned. So over time, its precise location was lost. And Betsy Lewis, she moved from Ohio to Georgia in 1912 at the age of 23, and she was a really avid researcher, and she ended up becoming the official historian for McIntosh County by 1929. And throughout the 1930s, she studied records from the London archives, trying to pinpoint the fort's location. When she thought she had narrowed it down, archaeologists conducted a dig throughout the 1940s to confirm her hypothesis, and they found out they discovered the gravesite where the soldiers that had died here were buried pretty much right where she expected it to be, and their remains are still there today. So by 1949, the state acquired the land where Fort King George originally stood, and by the 1970s, our museum was built. In 1972, we became a state historic site operated by the Georgia Department of Natural Resources. And the DNR partnered with the Lower Altamaha Historical Society to raise funds for a reconstruction of the fort itself. You can see this is where they were rebuilding the blockhouse, and this is what it looks like today. The blockhouse construction was finished in 1988. And since then, the rest of the fort buildings have been completed and they're continuously being restored. The original fort only lasted for 6 years, and our reconstructed has lasted for over 3 decades now. So it does require maintenance from time to time, pretty much constant upkeep. And this reconstruction gives us on staff, as well as our volunteers, the wonderful opportunity to educate our visitors with a more immersive experience than a museum on its own would. And that's really what it's all about, is bringing our wonderful 300 years of history to you, the public, so that we can all enjoy and cherish and preserve it for the people who are here even 300 years from now. So now I will take some questions. Ranger Michael has been collecting your questions in the chat for me, and I'll address some of those now.
All right. And again, this is first off, can y'all hear me on the microphone over there? I'm going to talk as if we can. Perfect. So again, you still have some questions. We haven't closed out the number of questions yet, so if you've got some more, come back in that chat box. We'll keep fielding them this way. You see if I can fix that echo that I see there. I'll choose to put my my headphones back in and see if that helps. All right, we'll see if that helps at all. The first question that I've got out of the room was back about Queen Anne.
Okay.
We have that slide mentioning Queen Anne's War. Who is Queen Anne? Why did she get the war named after her?
So Queen Anne was the Queen of Britain at the time of Queen Anne's War. She was the reigning monarch, and the war ended up getting named after her. I don't have a lot of biographical information on Queen Anne specifically at the back of my head right now, but that is who the war was named after, was the Queen of Britain.
All right. All right. Do you have somebody who was a little bit more curious about Miss Betsy Lewis and did we know any more information about her?
Let's see. So I think I covered some of this already, but she was born in Ohio. And in 1912 is when she decided to move to Georgia, primarily just because she was really interested in history, and she knew that, Fort King George, that its location wasn't, totally public knowledge at that time. It had kind of become lost over the ages, and she was interested in researching through the records and finding that out. So I believe that's primarily what brought her to this area. She was alone. She wasn't married at that time when she moved. She was only 23. And just through, I believe she was a school teacher here, and through teaching and doing her research and, gathering a reputation like that, she was able to get the title of McIntosh County's official historian. And yeah, it was through her research that we found out where Fort King George is today. She's the one who got that archaeological dig done and confirmed the location, and we really have her to thank for us being a historic site today. Because if it wasn't for her research, this would just be another bluff along the marsh and there wouldn't be a fort rebuilt here or a museum or anything like that. So we really have her to thank.
And
And also, if you're still curious a little bit more about Miss Betsy Lewis, we are going to have a speaker of the year. I believe it's our October meeting, where our current McIntosh County local historians will be talking about the life and legacy of Miss Betsy.
The nature of the life here.
Life here at Bulletin Village for those soldiers. Can you
give a brief explanation of what made it so hard?
Let's see. Well, lots of things. They were not very healthy. Like I said, they got scurvy on the trip over here, and they were older to begin with. They were kind of malnourished while they were here. A, they were drinking all of the time. B, they didn't really have a lot of fresh food. Most of their food was packaged up in barrels that were shipped to them from Charlestown. And it was hardtack and dried peas. They didn't really do much gardening. They may have had a turnip patch for a little bit, but not for the whole occupation. They didn't really do much hunting or fishing, so all of their food was old and stale and not very nutritious. On top of that, they didn't really practice good hygiene. They didn't understand how that propagated diseases back then. They were all crammed together, sharing bunks in one tiny little building. They would recycle uniforms. When a man would die of some disease, the next recruit coming in would just get some of that recycled material for his uniform. So they didn't really understand how to stay healthy as well back then as we do today. Oh, okay. So yeah, if that wraps it up, thank you guys for coming today to our part 1 of our Tricentennial Speaker Series of 2021. Like Michael mentioned, we have another one coming up next month. That's going to be on Sunday, February 28th at 3 p.m. Dr. Patrick J. Holliday and Amy Watson Roberts will be doing their presentation, and those are the authors of this book, Gullah Geechee Heritage in the Golden Isles, and they will be able to tell you all about the Gullah Geechee history of our area. So thank you all for coming today. I appreciate you listening, and I hope you learned something. Y'all have a great day.
Recording. There's don't end the meeting here.